Hi, am I audible? Okay, just a fair warning, if you see me shaking, it's because I've had two coffees and 2 hours of sleep, so just ignore it. Okay, starting my timer in three, two, one. When you take away the human dignity, when you steal the lives and the purpose of lives to millions of people throughout history, right? We tell you first of all that it's principally legitimate for these developing nations, or these nations who have previously been colonized, to reject all means of comments from these nations, right? And it's just completely illegitimate for these states to interfere in the first place, right? Okay, so what are we going to cover in this speech? First of all, I'm just going to talk about the principle. Secondly, I'm just going to prove why practically it's also a reason why these nations are nations that have colonized these countries. Why is it likely that they're going to be exploiting these nations in the first place? But before that, just a few key characterizations I want to clear up in my speech, right? First of all, why is it that these colonized states have huge amounts of influence, right? When you already have the historical ability and the financial capacity, for example, and you already have that historical means to actually hold your power against these smaller nations and these nations that you have previously already colonized, you're going to have that ability to pressure nations. You're going to have the ability to say I'm going to impose a sanction on you, for example, or you already have things like really strong media outlets that are going to be able to, for example, influence a larger section of a population, or places around the world even, to actually see your viewpoint, right? Secondly, I think that there's just a largely Eurocentric viewpoint throughout just throughout the world, right? And this is something that's a predominant narrative that we firmly think is going to be something that is held against these nations, right? And secondly, I think that just richer countries usually have negative ones for these colonized countries, as in they comment about things for example, coups, or they comment about things as in the governmental structure, the government structure of these countries in the first place, right? And thirdly, I think just in general, most countries just want their own ones first, in a world where these countries are simply doing it out of their goodwill, or these colonized countries are simply offering reparations, for example. We're gonna tell you why that is something that we also reject, and it's something that we're gonna go hard line on, even if you want to say, oh, these nations are probably if they want to comment on things for example, democracy, we are going to tell you why that is going to be harmful, even in your best case, right? So first argument, why is it the principles of the negative effects of colonization and colonialism, right? We tell you that when you've already disrupted the living of these communities, when you have already taken away the purpose of life, and you have stripping things away from these natives and from the people that are living now, and at the point at which they are the way that they are, for example, things like political instability and coups, because they weren't able to actually build up that political stability, where at the point at which you come in, you plunder their things, you take their stuff, and you introduce new policies and new rules which actively oppress them. At the point at which you do that, we tell you that it's just principally wrong for you to actually engage, it is principally wrong for you to engage in these countries, and then comment on for example, the way that for example, the political instability in their government and stuff, when you are the sole reason for that, right? We tell you why it is the power that these nations hold now. It's mainly because of the amount of the amount of colonization that has happened, and the amount of power that they have taken for these things, in terms of things like capital resources, things and things for example, just soft politics, right? The ability for them to actually spread this narrative that oh, these nations are bad, right? We tell you that the principle to self-defense from these nations, the principle for them to actually stand up and say, no, we don't want your comments. We reject your comments. We don't think that they are legitimate in this. We don't think it is legitimate for you to say this. Upon you do that, you take away this unique power that these developing nations have, right? But secondly, why is it just worse off in these nations, is what is likely going to happen under exploitation? Before that, I would like to take POI if anyone has anything, preferably from closing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Why does doing something in the past strip you of the right to do something better in the future?
I think that regardless, when you have when you already have that principle to be when you already have that principle to actually want to hold this against them, when that's already a common narrative in society currently, and at the point at which you are able, at the point at which you are at the point at which you already have done these things to these like colonized nations, we tell you then it is just like principally correct because of the fact that you are all like you currently are benefiting from those things, right? You are directly benefiting from, for example, the past effects of colonialism. Your reason why you are able to then hold this against them is because you colonize them in the first place. We say that it's just completely principally legitimate, right? And it's just like something that we think just stands in this debate, right? So moving on to my second argument, why is it worse off for these nations, and like why is it that they're more likely to be exploited under our right? First of all, I think just like the narrative of like these like developed nations having, for example, the moral high ground, for example, if they want to make reparations, and like just like the common like the predominant narrative of, like, for example, things like the white savior complex. I think that these are like common narratives that are like actually going to like be worse under like these are common narratives that are going to be worse under your world. It is problematic because in places like Europe, or like places where like they have colonized countries before, we tell you that that's just like it, like this white savior complex is just going to be amplified under your world, where
Right.
they're allowed to comment on specific policies, right? Secondly, I think that like just like domestic nations have domestic policies that like speak to, like, for example, the sovereignty or like the independence of that nation, right? Regardless of like whether you say like there are just like policies in those countries which speak to their independence. I think that like weakening their stance by saying like, oh, we are going to be listening to these nations who have already colonized us, I think that just like is something that is going to weaken their stance, and something that's going to be something that these like richer countries are going to be able to like exploit these colonized countries for. But before that, I will take your cue, I guess.
What happens to the scene of domestic politics when you completely shut out the previous pre-colonial leaders?
I think then you are able to actually amplify the stability of those politics in the first place, right? You are able to then stand against these like you are then able to stand against these countries, which is something I'll just move on to in my third point, right? We tell you that often there had to be like an anti-imperialist narrative that had to be woven throughout these countries in order for them to like break free from like the shackles of colonialism in the first place, right? We tell you that because these nations at the core of their post-colonialist identity is like something that is literally standing against anti-imperialism, we tell you that this principle is going these like policies and this like entire identity is going to be delegitimized under your side, right? And fourthly, I think even in the best case, if we say that, oh, we are going to allow for like reparations, for example, they are going to allow for like reparations and stuff, and that like somehow small nations are going to have the ability to like to pressure like larger nations into like feeling guilty for them somehow, right? Even at the point at which you say that, we tell you that the culture is different. Even in the best case, right, we tell you that things like democracy are not going to be like similar to those like that, like when you impose democracy upon these like countries, we are going to tell you that you have no idea what the culture is after you have left, right? You have no idea like what like their domestic politics look like. We tell you that it's just better under their side to actually go on with this, right? If we prefer a world in which you have like nations that are supported, and in which you have nations that are going to be principally justified in their right to actually reject these nations, right? What opposition has to prove to me why is like what opposition has to prove to you today is why it's principally legitimate, and why exactly it is that like these like domestic policies can be good, right? Now, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine remarks. Would like to call in a leader of opposition to begin the case from here, here.
Let me get a chat box first. Side government can take a moral high ground in this debate, but so long as they argue based on principle and principle alone, they simply cannot win this debate. Their basis is that this is principally illegitimate. However, we are going to tell you that the alternative leads to harmful practical outcomes. Something cannot be principally legitimate if it leads to harmful outcomes, because it means that people on the ground are going to suffer. So what are we going to prove to you on opening opposition? The first is that why we're going to tell you why it's going to lead to more stability on our side of the debate, and that the alternative is going to be much worse. This looks like disproportionate representation, unstable institutions, and a high and distinct possibility that the country is going to backslide into conflict. We're going to tell you the first. So how's this going to come by? We think that number one, there's going to be a clear line being drawn. Commenting equals advising. We think that at the end of the day, the autonomy is going to be reserved for the government. A few rebuttals before I move into my substantives, right? The first, they ask, on opening government, they ask, oh, so what if it ends up being exploitative? Notice how there are strong anti-imperialistic sentiments from the West. The West already calls out China for being imperialistic with their One Belt, One Road initiative. They cannot call out people for being imperialistic and at the same time being hypocritical and be imperialistic with their former colonies. Second of all, also noting how there is a strong liberal trend around and that there is an increased scrutiny on the governments from the people, such as people in the USA and people in England, being very mindful of their government if they are exploiting other countries and also holding multinational corporations accountable for and also for the countries and uh, in their participation in any form of exploitation of the developing world. We think that that form of increased scrutiny means that they have strong incentives to not be exploitative, right? So why is it going to be successful? Is that those colonial states have incentive to ensure the stability and economic well-being of the post-colonial countries. More on that later. On the first argument, why the alternative is going to be much worse. We're going to prove to you why post-colonial states are, number one, unstable, and second of all, that there is a very high and distinct likelihood of them backsliding into conflict. The first is that there are multiple ethnicities within those post-colonial countries and that they have been tribalistic and are historically so for a long time. Previously, under colonial rule, their leadership is very much localized. For example, the tribal leader leads the village and answer to the colonizers. And second of all, is that there are going to be strong ethnic tensions surrounding all of these tribalistic forms of government, that they are suspicious of the other ethnicities and their identity of every single one on the ground. Every single one of the people on the ground is surrounded by being in diametrical opposition to the other ethnicities. Now, in the newly established government, the process of ensuring equal and fair representation is going to be pretty much impossible, right? And we'll tell you why, even why it is going to be unlikely to achieve that in the long run. Second of all, the lack of representation in the government and what causes it. Number one, the emergence of political dynasties. We'll tell you more on that later and how it cements how it means that there is going to be impossible to achieve a centralized form of government that ensures fair and equal representation. And second of all, just purely any single issue that is now issued, any single policy that is issued from the central government is going to be viewed with suspicion, and it's going to be seen through the lens of injustice by the other by the leaders of the other ethnicities in representation of their own people. This can be issues like the distribution of resources in the developing country where there are limited amount of resources and the centralized government say, well, we must shift the distribution of resources in such a manner it will likely be seen as being unfair to the other ethnicities, right? So what's the comparative now? Number one is that those previously colonialist states are going to have an incentive to ensure the stability and the economic well-being of the post-colonial country, which is what happens on our side of the debate. Number one is that there will still be economic states in it for them, and such as those companies not having completely pulled out. And second of all, there are a liberal trend right now. For example, in the Western countries, their own citizens will call their governments out if those post-colonial state is being crippled, since there's a very clear link between colonialism and the current state of affairs in those countries, like how the Red Cliff line between India and Pakistan has led to conflict and all of these kind of things. And third of all, are just purely sanctions from international organizations. We believe that that at the very least, international organizations have a stake to ensure that there isn't and going to be exploitative measures being done. So towards the second argument, that is a national identity built on anti-colonialism is dangerous in and of itself. We're going to tell you why leaders entrench their power by propagating narratives of anti-colonial resistance and how that's going to be so harmful. The first is that oftentimes after conflict or after colonialization, the ruling party and the people in power at that time have structural incentives to want to entrench their power. They often do things like spreading narratives that we are the ones who liberated you from their colonial oppressors. We're the ones who brought you freedom. And all of these leaders looks like things like intense cronyism, such as them having a monopoly on all of the resources within that state. within the state itself. So, sorry, with such an intense form of cronyism, it means that the country's economy and by extension, the people's well-being isn't going to be very much good. But before I move on, any POIs, preferably from closing. Okay, seeing as there are none, I'll move on. So why is this going to be so bad, right? The first is that it's going to be incredibly hard to hold these people in power accountable because they use emotional narratives to manipulate the people. They're able to utilize shame to make the people feel bad for betraying the party that liberated them. Second of all, is that you simply cannot build up democratic norms because part of the strategy of those oppressive political parties is wanting to significantly weaken opposition where they cannot compete. So it's going to be very hard to reform nations. The government can use this rhetoric to cement their power for decades before any form of governmental development even happens, such as the ANC or the INC. And they are going to use it to prey upon the deepest fears and insecurities of the people, and hence it leads to increased corruptions in those government. There's no incentive for them to provide good things for their citizens, and they're told for generations that this government did the best thing possible for them. So why it won't improve going down the line is simply because those political dynasties have every single incentive to remain in power. If they get put down, they're going to be retribution for political opponents, hence they're often autocratic. And second of all, is that they simply benefit from staying in power, right? The fact that they have already established a cronyism and monopoly on all of the country's resources means that it is going to be economically hard to even try to completely remove their ties to and their positions of power within the country. So how exactly does this change under our side? Number one, we have more discourse because ideas moving through the political sphere of the country means a single party cannot challenge it. Second of all, we're able to get concessions from these governments. We're able to get reparations. This is because there's active participation in our domestic politics and means leaders can force them to give things like humanitarian or development aid. Third of all, is that we can advice on things like democratic norms to ensure that one party cannot monopolize the political scene, more representation for people on the ground. Fourth is that former power cementing this commenting on that scene can make people aware of the abuses that exist and can break free from the emotional narratives that are used to manipulate them. All that means is that if we engage opening government on the premise of the stable country, this is because we tell you that things get significantly better for people because the norms and resources are better. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine remarks. Would like to call on the DPM to close the case from side opening government. Here, here.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me just get my timer sorted. Starting in, okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. A very good morning, Honorable Chair, for the opponents, of course, members of the floor. Okay, I'm going to structure my speech in this way. First, I'm going to address some miscellaneous rebuttals, then I'm going to move on into reaffirming our principle and why it's saying why essentially it's justified. Then I'm going to move on into some substantive and then end with some general rebuttals and tie that in, of course, to our points. First of all, yes, miscellaneous rebuttals. There was an interesting POI brought up on how current colonizers, even though they do something in the past, right, they may choose to do something better in the future, and hence that's an argument on why they should interfere in domestic policy of former colonies. Well, this argument is technically flawed because you have to understand that these nations still have elements of self-interest in everything that they say. Theresa May, the ex-prime minister of Britain, arguably the biggest colonizer in history, even said our foreign policy has our own self-interest first, and I am unashamed of that. That is an actual Theresa May quote. So you can already see that foreign policy and hence their intervention in domestic policy of these colonized nations has an element of self-interest. So even though these nations may not go to the extent that they want to colonize these nations anymore, there is still an element of self-interest, and when they share domestic policy or basically any advice on domestic policy, and that assertion of domestic policy is not beneficial in our case, as I will get on later on. There are negative effects more than positive effects created. Okay, so let's talk about our principle together because that ties in most of our debate today from side government, right? What is our principle? It's the argument of morality. It's the argument of respect to former colonies, especially from the colonizer. We reaffirm this by talking about 3 layers of analysis. First of all, the negative effects of colonialism in the past. What did colonialism do by these colonized nations? First of all, it disrupted standard living. It disrupted development, disrupted culture, it took away resources, and we can understand there was periods of mass oppression and violence. So what happened to the colonized nation during this time? There was a loss of sovereignty, there was a loss of right to control their own destiny, a loss of right to play their role in their own development and diplomacy, and that's obviously negative. So what does domestic policy actually stand for? That's the second point of the analysis. Domestic policy actually stands for a nation's independence and sovereignty. And so when you interfere in domestic policy, it's almost like the Japanese having a say in Malaysian domestic policy, or the British having a say in Indian and African, Saharan countries' domestic policy. What you're doing is you're interfering in that sovereignty that you took from them during this, hundreds of years ago when you colonized that nation. That obviously has a negative effect. And yes, we are taking the moral high ground because it is relevant, because this principle is relevant to this debate. Because one, it's ineffective. First of all, because these nations will come across, these colonizers nations will come across as almost trying to take control, and the anti-imperialism sentiment that they have been creating to reaffirm their stance, in the foreign global, aspect, it will be almost detrimented, because here we have nations trying to almost assert themselves into these nations, almost trying to have a say in their sovereignty after they took away their sovereignty and after they got their independence back. We also talked about media. There are two sides how media affects this debate today. First of all, media has a say because first of all, we have to understand that these nations have, the colonizers have, of course, strong media, strong ties to media, and they may use the media to almost exponentially increase the threat that, let's say, this colonized nation has, and then justify this colonizers. That's why they have a say into domestic policy. And so media has a negative role here. The second impact that media has is that the media may essentially show the imperialism nature of these countries trying to dictate or have comments on the domestic policy of, let's say, nations' former colonies. And that's negative for the colonizer, for the former colonizer, because of course there's a negative sentiment created. And our third point, a third layer of analysis, is that large states tend to have large influence, and it's these large states which were the former colonizers, right? We can understand that. So one, they may pressure nations, and that's a breach of our principle because of the large political clout, the large foreign clout, the large finance. We also talked that the rich have their own incentives at hand first. They have their own wants at first, and so they can dictate government systems. They can dictate fiscal policy, and this can have negative impacts in the long run. We also talked about how there's a difference of culture, and it's difficult to dictate nations when there's a difference of culture in that other nation, right? Because there's years of quashing, and political natures are very different in both these nations, and so your own domestic ones may not fit in that culture. The first speaker, the leader of opposition, came out with an interesting point, and it's that these nations tend to have tribal governments, right? Meaning that a centralized government is very hard to create. It's nearly impossible. So how is your nation, right? How is these big Western nations, for example, going to have a say in the domestic policy of these nations when the domestic policy is already almost tangled and different? There isn't one single policy because, again, these are all tribal established nations. And so it's basically ineffective, again, for this domestic country to come across and, of course, basically show foreign policy. The most important point I think opposition is going to take throughout this debate is that how do you deal with oppressive political governments in these nations, and that these big nations should have a say in dealing with these political governments. First of all, let's say an oppressive political government exists in this nation. How is a domestic nation going to come across? How is a nation going to come across and establish or give a comment on domestic policy to this oppressive government when this oppressive government in this nation can use the fact that a former colonizer is trying to dictate policy in our country? It has negative effects, and so hence the oppressive political government can hence rile up and raise more support for their policies, for their domestic policies, because then they can show that, look, this former colonizer is trying to interfere in our policies. And so that has a negative and ineffective debate. A negative and ineffective effect in the long run, because you're essentially helping the oppressive political government on their side by interfering in their domestic policy. Again, to reaffirm, because this oppressive political government can use the fact that you're interfering to their benefit, to show, look, a former colonizer is trying to colonize our nation again, and that is a very negative effect, and hence they can gain more support. And for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really proud of the post. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for his remarks. Would like to call in the DLO to conclude the case from side opening opposition. Here, here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right. Uh, I'm going to be talking about three things. One, I'm going to talk about the principal justification because OG only seems to want to argue on that. Two, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between countries, whether this is likely to change. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about domestic politics and why it's significantly worse under their side. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to point out three problems with OG. One, they assume that all these comments are bad. And even in the worst case, when they make this trade-off at the beginning, which they try to do, is sort of like, well, even if they're able to provide things like reparations, we still don't want them because they have influence and because you can't understand things on the ground. The second thing that they say is, well, they say that forms of democracies are not worth having because they don't understand like the cultures and norms of the people. What's the distinction here? Because presumably they know something because they did colonize the people and they had significant amounts of presence within the area. So it's unclear if this cultural distinction is so bad at all. But number two, even if they prove there is a cultural distinction, I'm unclear as to why this is suddenly stopping all forms of aid. Like presumably some things don't require the culture to provide aid. Things like resources, things like building up industries or way to keep your MNCs within that area. It's unclear why this needs to have the cultural norms of the people on the ground. But what we would say was they probably understand this to a certain extent. Three, it's unclear if democracy being imposed is necessarily going to lead towards bad outcomes there. Because what they say is that there is a cultural distinction. What we are saying is the cultural distinction is unlikely to be harmful to the extent that they talk about, because these kind of things are easily understood by all groups of people. The third thing that they wanted to say was there is influence. Yeah, we agree, because that's how aid works. Like people are not going to be completely altruistic. The problem here is that they don't actually understand what is the principal justification here. Because unfortunately, OG only chooses to debate this on the basis of colonialism bad and therefore we win. One, it's unclear if the governments of people today were directly responsible for mass atrocities of the past few centuries. Their analysis was, well, the British PM was self-interested. The problem here is that's the reason why they want to give out aid in the first place. Like obviously states are not altruistic, and if they want to give out aid, it's presumably for something in return. The burden on their side was to prove why the aid that was provided to them was not worth having just because they had some form of cultural influence when the comparative was literally no aid at all, and they don't engage within the worst case, so therefore they already lose out here. We think we give you many structural reasons as to why they will act in good and accountable ways. One, there's economic stakes in it for them because companies still haven't completely pulled out of these areas. B, there's a liberal trend right now in the way which voters are acting. Their own civilians will call them out if the post-colonial state is completely crippled. C, we have to give you sanctions of international organizations. These 3 points were left completely unresponded to by the speaker before me, so I'm unclear how I'm supposed to engage on that. So therefore, the basis of principal justification alone, even if they're able to prove that these colonizers did bad things and they have an influence here, it's unclear as to why that influence significantly weighs out over the practical benefits that we brought to you. Therefore, that point cannot stand in the debate. The second thing I want to talk about here is as to why exactly is the relationship going to be look like? Because I think what OG says here was a formal quote is like the thing that OG doesn't address is what's exactly the comparative, because DPM says that the media paints colonial powers and like white people or something that's bad and therefore able to entrench their power, because their response is domestic leaders can rile up support. We have two responses. One, never quantified this harm, but two, that literally concedes to our argumentation, because what we said was in the event that you do not let these people come in and necessarily participate within the domestic politics, our response was that this would happen anyway. It's unclear as to why suddenly domestic leaders aren't going to do this regardless, and they're only able to do this uniquely at the point which these people aren't participating within the country's politics. What we said was when you don't let that people participate in the country's politics, that's when it's far easier to not hold them accountable, because it necessarily means they could entrench their power and no other form or no other force could necessarily challenge the monopolization of power within that state. What this necessarily means is that all the harms that we talked to you about as to why anti-colonial governments and forms of national identities built around pushing against colonial powers were necessarily going to be far more entrenched under the side of OG, which you don't necessarily allow these people to participate there. So literally their response actually mechanizes our claim, because even if they say that media paints colonial powers as a whole, there's far more happen on their side, actually happens on greater quantities within their side. The second thing they say is, well, they will do, like what we said was, they'll do worse things to you if you shut them out, because the very incentives that OG identifies, if it is true that countries are going to want to participate and want to have some form of influence on developing countries, unclear why that doesn't happen on their side, because presumably just because you shut them out of domestic politic discourse doesn't mean they can't act in ways that are far worse. They can still influence the ways in which international politics works. They can still have some form of influence within your government. What we said was it's far more easier for you to engage with them in a way that was constructive when you necessarily allowed them to participate within the political discourse rather than just shutting them out completely and like just expecting them to act as altruistic actors. So they never actually improve the likelihood of this happening on their side. The third thing here is that, well, we asked the POI as to what happened to domestic politics when you completely shut them out. Their response was, well, we will ensure stability for these nations. Unclear why that happens. The premise of this was, one, that instability was directly caused by the participation of former colonial powers within domestic politics, and two, that domestic politics would otherwise be completely stable without this. I can just give you 3 random reasons as to why they are unstable, regardless of whether whether the colonial powers participate or not. 1, because of the fallout after a significant change in ruling governments. 2, because of the huge amount of capital outflow from these countries at the point which you shut them out. 3rd, because of things like ethnic conflict that LO identifies that did not receive a sufficient response from them. So what all this necessarily means is that domestic politics isn't going to be significantly more stable under their side, which leads to the 3rd point here as to why exactly domestic politics isn't going to be stable, because we identified like numerous structural reasons as to why these people are going to entrench their power in ways that are really bad. We said about how exactly they use emotional narratives to entrench their power and say, well, we were the ones who liberated you from the former colonial powers. We were the ones who got the white leaders out of the country. Therefore, you should continue to vote for us. All this received no response, and actually they received a response that mechanized our claim. When necessarily give you reasons as to why it necessarily changes. 1, because necessarily means all these people are then going to be participating within that country, and therefore it's far easier to hold these leaders accountable. What we identified earlier was that no matter what, leaders are always self-interested, which was their claim. And therefore, it mechanizes our claim that leaders within this domestic politics are then going to want to be self-interested, and therefore the only way to hold them to account was then to have these people participate within the politics. 2, I think we're able to get significant concessions from these governments because we're able to have reparations. Insofar as those colonial powers are participating within domestic politics and trying to have a way to say how things work and how necessarily their businesses are being governed and how their industries are have their policies put out there. This is the active participation in domestic politics, means leaders can use those same narratives to force them to give things like aid for people on the ground, therefore get significantly more reparations under our side. I think this is just more weighed out against what the OG brings, because OG says that it's going to be influence. What we say is the comparative is literally no aid, and that's far more likely to be worse, given that all the instability that they talk about is still going to exist regardless, because it stems from a different reason than they identify. But thirdly, I think we're able to get more democratic norms to ensure that one party cannot completely monopolize the political scene. So we engage them completely on the idea of stability, and we still win here. The final thing I want you to note here, what exactly is the worst case that we're willing to take? Even if they are going to want to be influential in ways that are bad, why is it significantly better? 1, because presumably, if you do not let this at all, it's going to be a one act that's going to be far worse anyway. But 2, what we would say is if you do not let these bad countries taking them at their best have a say in this politics, they are likely to pull out from things like have their industries being pulled out of these areas. There's huge amounts of outflow of capital that means, and therefore means it's far lower GDP and it's far harder for people to put food on the table. What they've assumed on the opening government team was that people are going to be completely happy just that these white people were shut out. What we would say is we would rather have people being able to eat at dinner at night. What we would rather is having people being able to not just have one political figure in power and necessarily monopolize all the discourse that existed. We're very proud to win this debate.
I thank the speaker for his fine remarks. I would like to call in the member of government to open open the case for lower half and CG. Here.
I'm really sorry. Can I just go to the bathroom real quick?
Sure.
All right, sorry. Give me a minute.
And could the spectator please lower their hand, I guess? Thanks.
All right. Am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I'll prefer POIs in the chat for today, right? Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the deadlock in the opening half is very simple. OG only wants to talk about the abstract principles of colonialism. OO wants to run their case on a very convenient, narrow characterization where all of a sudden all the mechanizations can happen and refuse to engage on the worst case of the house. I'm going to do a few things in my speech. Number 1, I'm going to break that deadlock by providing you the nuance that was severely lacking in the opening house by number one, completing the principal argument that OG gave you and addressing the practical harms that OO seems to want to frame the debate in. The first thing I'm going to do is just respond very briefly to OO and just let them fall out of the debate. They say 3 claims. Number one, recognize how the entire OO case is assuming an incredibly convenient framework or mechanization because number one, they assume that the comments that are coming into these countries are inherently good and in the form of advice. I think that even if we take them on their best case and it is advice, they have to engage with the fact that this in itself is neocolonialism, but we heard no response. But the second thing is they have a disingenuous characterization of what these post-colonial states look like in that they're extremely unstable and seemingly cannot function without intervention from these Western states. Notice how that entire line of analysis recognizes the fact that recognizes the justification that these Western liberal countries use to want to intervene by claiming that these countries cannot operate outside of like having our interference or having our advice. But even if it is true that these countries are inherently unstable because of things like ethnic divide and just political instability in the government, I would argue that the intervention from these colonizer states is going to make that even worse because now you've got butting heads within the government. If the characterization that Umar wanted to give you, that these governments are inherently power hungry is true, why is it not necessarily true that when these advice comes in, you're just going to create even more conflict that results in more instability in that country? No proof from the OO as to how those harms necessarily accrue. The third thing that they tell you is that, the second thing they tell you that the national identity based on anti-colonial ideas is bad. Number one, if you track their speeches, they never told you necessarily why it's principally unjustified for a country to build their sentiment on the fact that they were liberated from their colonizer states. If they agree that colonization is bad, they have to also concede that forming your national identity based on the fact that you're escaping from that cycle of poverty and that cycle of degradation is inherently good. But secondly, I would argue it's symmetrical at best because there's no guarantee that on the opposition bench, these leaders are still not going to use those same anti-colonial sentiments to, like, I don't know, instigate the public the way Umar wants. So at best, this argument is a wash. The third thing that we've heard out of opening opposition is that they don't want a single political party in these states to monopolize the entire political state. I think that I don't know why that logical link is made on opening opposition, because if the premise of that argument is monopolization is bad, why are they then fighting for more countries to come in and insert their own monopolization on those countries? Overall, I just don't think the opening opposition stands. First question I'm going to answer, and here's where we get into the vertical extension. Why the historical context matters? Because all seems to want to disregard the historical context by virtue of it not being principally justified. I think what was lacking in the OG's case was that they refused to go beyond why colonialization was bad in the first place, and they only wanted to talk about it being like bad in the sense that they came and took our serenity and peace. The reason why it's bad in the nuance of the motion in terms of domestic politics is because the policies that we were governed with under colonization directly informs the way our domestic politics work today. This looks like the UK's policies of divide and conquer in Malaysia and like the Indian states, resulting in the divide and ethnic conflicts that are currently prevailing. This looks like the policies enacted by the British on like the princely states of India, resulting in the divide of like ethnic groups within Pakistan and India in and of itself. This means that if it's true that the UK government now wants to come in and comment on that divide and advise its leaders on how to resolve it, we say it's principally unjustified for them to do so, considering the fact that the very reason why that conflict exists to begin with is because it was caused by the UK government in the past. Even if they want to run the chronological argument that Boris Johnson today is not responsible for it, I still think it's just principally unjustified because of the dynamics at play within like the world itself. The dynamics between the UK and India is not predicated on historical context, no thank you, but it's predicated on the fact that the accumulation of historical context still prevails today, which means regardless of who is currently in power, and if Boris Johnson was not the colonizing power of India in those days, the fact that the dynamics still exists in status quo is enough to render it illegitimate. The reason this line of analysis is important is because it completes the OG's principal analysis of why specifically comments on domestic policies are bad, in that the domestic policies or domestic politics that are currently being commented on by these colonized states were the same conflicts they directly caused to begin with. The second argument I'm going to bring to you is the practical outcomes. And here's where we engage directly with the OO's case, because they seemingly only want to talk about why it's practically beneficial for you to receive advice and why the alternative of being shut out automatically renders you a failed state. I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to run down 3 possible outcomes of what can happen under this debate. The first thing that can happen is that the leaders of these countries listen to the advice and listen to those comments. In this case, we say that even if they do so, it's going to be principally unjustified simply because it perpetuates a hierarchy and perpetuates the neo-colonialist like structures that are still at play on Earth. This is because of one reason. It's because that the dynamics at play between the post-colonial states and the colonizer countries are just inherently different. Even if we want to concede or we want to buy the OO's argument that these advices are beneficial, that's extremely subjective because the dynamics that are at play at the sociopolitics within Malaysia and the UK, for example, are inherently different. If the UK advises Muhyiddin to liberalize trade, that doesn't mean it's necessarily good for Malaysia because UK does not understand the nuances of domestic politics within Malaysia itself. This means that they cannot claim that all of these advices are going to be automatically beneficial just because they come from a white man's country, because even if it is true that it comes from a white man's country and it's beneficial, that in itself plays into the neo-colonialist mindset that whatever these white people say is inherently true. The second thing under this argument then is that if it's true that these, like Muhyiddin or the Prime Minister of Malaysia wants to listen to Boris Johnson's advice, we say that it's probably not going to to lead to beneficial outcome for Malaysia itself, simply because of the mismatch in understanding and how Malaysia works as a country. So on the highest grounds, if they want to claim that they're going to listen to beneficial advice and develop as a country, they can't prove that it's going to be guaranteed, and it's speculative at best because of the mismatch of policies at play and the dynamics in the world. But secondly, I would argue, and more likelihood, no, thank you, POI, is that the advice that's going to come in is more likely going to be just negative advice, because you have to understand that these people do not have an incentive to want to protect our country. That's a characterization that all fail to want to engage in. It's because there's no goodwill for the UK to want to protect the sanctity of Malaysia or its former colonies. The goodwill of the UK comes in the form of wanting to colonize these countries in the neo sense by virtue of having investment trades and like MNCs within these countries, which means more often than not, the advice that's coming in is going to be not objective, but subjective, to want to pursue their interests in these countries to make like trade more beneficial to the UK, which means that in the best case, the advice coming in is just going to paint the picture that just benefits the UK or these colonizer states even more, and doesn't actually do anything for domestic policies on the ground. We beat OO on their own race. The second thing that can happen, of course, is that they don't listen to the advice. But even if that happens and nothing necessarily changes, we still say it's principally bad because it perpetuates the hierarchy currently in play, its status quo. This is because the UK is still generally seen as a white man's country and the more developed country, which means there's no way for these colonized or post-colonial states to fight back against that rhetoric. If they, like, imagine if Malaysia or any other post-colonial state wanted to comment on the domestic affairs of the UK, they wouldn't be taken as seriously because of the power dynamics that at play. Which means if we want to concede that the UK is still going to comment on their post-colonies domestic politics, it still entrenches these countries in a cycle of hierarchy that they can never escape, because the white man still wants to tell us what to do. These lines of analysis are important because they complete the practical arguments and opening exchange of principle, because regardless of the outcome on the ground, these people are still going to be entrenched in a cycle of neocolonialism that they can't escape from. For those reasons, CG takes the debate.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. Would like to call on the member of opposition to begin the case from side OO. Here.
So at the beginning, I said a please point on the bubble, but I do welcome the point on chat, please. So, yeah. Okay, so I will now begin this speech. 3, 2, 1. The three extensions from this closing opposition. The firstly, why the post-colonized states have an active obligation to save those kind of people. This specific context in which the kind of post-colonial states will get better off thanks to the comments made by the superpowers. We think these kind of thing is just legitimate or just should be obliged because they have an active duty to save this kind of vulnerable country. Secondly, we'll tackle the nuance of this motion while commenting not sanction such a direct policy, but this kind of indirect way of affecting this kind of country is something legitimate. Specifically, we'll tackle on the core of this debate. Thirdly, we will extend this debate in the from the different frame from the OO, how in our side of the house, human rights violation currently happening for example, Myanmar or Uyghur are likely to be better off on our side of the house at the moment of which we live in these kind of remarks is legitimate. All the refutations to be integrated in my speech. So the first extension from our side of the house, why these kind of post-colonial states such as US or Europe or the past, including Japan, have an active duty to save those kind of nations, right? The firstly, as they said, the colonial, because some superpowers colonize the entire nations, their political structure just collapsed, and oftentimes the kind of colonized states lacks knowledge of how to develop their own countries. Because of this, their industrialization is slow. Because of this, the resources are scarce. Therefore, the coup are more likely to happen. Please note that under both OG and CG, they never prove how on their side of the house they can make situations substantially better. They said that some people might get better off, they can be independent of the post-colonized states, but it does not necessarily mean that they can be recovered from the situation upon which this is imposed by the post-superpowers. At this occasion, we think the US or UK or these kind of colonized states have an active duty to save those kind of people, given that they actively harm those kind of people. Of course, they have to actively consent it. Just leaving out or just say like I have to do nothing. This is not enough, right? Of course, some reparation might be done under the status quo, but that is just not enough, right? Education should be done in the long term. Technological development or technological instruction should be done in the long term. At this occasion, the current compensation is just not so enough. Therefore, we think more action should be necessary on our side of the house. Therefore, some kind of action should be taken by the UK or these kind of superpowers. That is, therefore, activity is something that these kind of countries should play. So that is a kind of, therefore, their principal issue is just not enough to legitimize this kind of compensation. But moving on to the second issue, why the compensation in the form of commenting on this kind of product is much best for these kind of developing nations, right? So we understand, for example, structure adjustment program or sanctions, for example, from company might be kind of offensive to some company, as OG and OCG said, just clinging to the best case. At this occasion, we think that some kind of direct action by this kind of the US might be inappropriate. We think these kind of actions should be only taken by the international organization, which act based on the statistic data and the view of each every nation. At this occasion, this kind of direct action might not be inappropriate if we charitable to the side of government. However, the comment has specific influence from the three perspectives. The firstly, international tensions are likely to be decreased in our side of the house. For example, take a look at Ukraine, for example. There, Ukraine is pressured by the Russia. If the US or Europe say that we are very happy to support this kind of Crimea Peninsula or like Ukraine, at this occasion, Russia are more likely hesitate to intervene to this kind of Ukraine, given that there's international tension and the US or Europe have a lot of nuclear weapons or a lot of military power, economic power. At this occasion, thanks to this kind of international tension made by this kind of comment, those who are under threat of the superpower are exclusively likely to be saved on our side of the house. If these kind of US are past colonized or past affected kind of states that past affected in this kind of Asia in the past do not comment anything. The Russia or China will intervene Taiwan or Ukraine. That is the worst case scenario, and they have an activity to prevent this from happening. At this specific context, this motion should be denied. But second thing is that they can that these kind of developing nations can get a different perspective. For example, they in under the status quo, they just believe that dictatorship might be good because that is a thing that has lasted for years. However, if the US or such an economically succeeding country declare that the democracy might be applicable to this company from some reasons. At this occasion, given this kind of successful example, they might broaden their own horizon, that this kind of situation, the democracy might be adapted to our society. The crucial difference here, this is not kind of forcible action, right? That is commenting on. At this occasion, firstly, they can consult academics a lot. The US said such a thing, it is very credible or not. They can have their increasing discussion likely to happen in this kind of developing nations. But secondly, we think given that a lot of superpower are likely to say different things. The China say that a BRI is best. The US or UK say that structure adjustment is best. At this occasion, the developing nation can compare this kind of each suggestion and which is best choice for them. At this occasion, such a just following the advice blindly is less likely to happen, given that each country have a different interest. The third difference made by this commenting on this kind of product is related to the third argument. Therefore, I'd like to explain it from. So moving on to the third issue, how the human rights violations are likely to be mitigated in our side of the house. So the firstly, under the status quo, that only the UK or US they should intervene to, for example, Myanmar or the China, through which they past colonized for the human violation happen toward the Rohingya or toward the Uyghur, for example. Why this kind of things should be legitimate? Comments should be legitimate. Firstly, that these kind of human rights violations exacerbated because of the colonialism, right? Because of the colonialism, economy just unstable. That's why the more conflict or this kind of pressure likely to happen. But secondly, they are not so directly responsible. But second reason is that there is only actor who can tackle this kind of problem, right? For the ASEAN or UN, however, is kind of have a bureaucratic system that's activity is quite slow. There's a veto system. There's a no intervention policy. At this occasion, US and UK should independently act toward human rights protection, right? So how in our side of the house, why this kind of situation is likely? From the two reasons, right? The firstly, US or Europe have a moral obligation to respect human rights, especially in the Biden administration. At this occasion, this kind of thing are likely to happen. But secondly, they have a hegemony toward. They want to keep the hegemony of the country, right? Therefore, they have an incentive to criticize other bad action of the human rights as long as they are hostile toward that nation. Therefore, the US have an incentive to fight against China. So at this occasion, we are likely to be criticized. So why this kind of structure is bad, but good, right? The firstly, there is a likely to be the citizens on the ground are likely to cheer up more, right? If they do not agree with the democracy, they will do nothing. But they do agree with the US or this kind of human rights concept, they are likely to actively more and more. At this occasion, grassroots rebel, the more rebellion toward the government are likely to happen. Given the human rights violation is most extensive, we are likely to have to prioritize this kind of issue. For all these reasons, closing our position, proudly oppose this motion.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. Would like to call in the Gov Whip to conclude the case from government and side O CG. Here.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I have several issues with the entirety of side op. Let's start with CO. CO tells us 3 things. CO tells us, number 1, there is a principal obligation for these states to comment and therefore interfere within these countries. Recognize that this directly contends with Shireen's characterization of how these countries have already, to some extent, gained stability, right? To a very large extent, like, I think it is disingenuous for the entirety of the op bench to want to claim that these countries need foreign intervention to remain stable, right? Because recognize that if it is true public checks and balances exist to prevent extreme interference, that same check and balance within the country would be able to keep politicians in check too. But secondly, I think the bulk of the principal argumentation coming from opposition proves that these states owe an obligation to reparations towards these countries, i.e. that they should help bring them up from, like, having stole their resources or cause like internal conflict. But this doesn't extend to an obligation to give comments about the domestic politics of these countries, given the fact that, like, CG has established to you how problematic the potential repercussions of giving comments, right? Recognize that just because they have an obligation to help these countries or to fix the problems of the past does not necessarily mean that comments are the best way to do it, insofar as these comments have been proven to potentially not only be harmful, but to entrench these states within a neo-colonial hierarchy, right? Secondly, they want to talk about how the compensation in the form of comments is inherently better because direct action is inappropriate. Insofar as direct intervention within these countries are already inappropriate, we think that by extension of that, at the point in time where these past colonial countries want to come and introduce and continue to induce and coerce certain narratives within these countries, not only does CG prove to you that, number 1, it is inherently non-altruistic in that they probably will portray themselves as a neutral third party to remove responsibility, because they're trying to introduce narratives that are obviously going to benefit them, right? This looks like opening trade so that, more MNCs can enter this country, so that these countries are able to access more trade in the first place. But secondly, like, if direct action is already inappropriate towards these countries, we think that by extension of that, comments from a past colonizer that has caused all of the issues that have led up to these circumstances within these countries also should not be appropriate, insofar as you cannot give advice for the problem that you have caused within these countries before, right? This will likely be viewed by these past colonies not only as, like, trying to impede upon their sovereignty, but also insofar as CO wants to claim that international tensions will be likely to decrease. We posit to you that it will probably be higher, because these individuals will look because this advice and comments will look like an act of criticism and an act of, pointing out their flaws that have been caused by them in the first place. We think that is disingenuous coming from the past colonizers in the first place. But secondly, that, like, none of the benefits that OP wants to claim within today's debate are likely to accrue for several reasons. Number 1, like, I think CO's, like, potential benefit of, like, human right violations mitigated isn't necessarily persuasive, in that, like, I think there's been global pressure for China to not, oppress the Uyghur Muslims, but they continue to do so anyway. We don't think that the comments from developed nations are going to do that to the fullest extent, insofar as, like, these countries probably who are engaging in human rights violations can be called out by like literally anyone else that are not their past colonizers and will still achieve the same effect. So we tell you that not only does the check and balance also exist under our side, but the harms are symmetric at best. So moving on to OO, right? Like OO tells us three things. I think firstly, starting with a disingenuous characterization of what these countries look like. Like yes, there may be several ethnic like instabilities, but we also have to understand that these like that the ethnic politics within these countries are to a very large extent invigorated by the entrance of these colonizers and brought like and caused by them in the first place. So we tell you that like insofar as number one, they are not necessarily unstable. I don't think Malaysia is having a civil war. But secondly, like even if they are unstable, we tell you that it is far more meaningful for these countries to continue on their track of pushing towards their own form of independence and creating their own like political landscape. It's far more beneficial than one that's trying to be imposed by them by the colonizers in the first place, considering the colonizers are obviously they are more likely than not going to offer disingenuous advice that is going to harm the country in the long run, because they are going to prioritize their own interests, right? Like OO says themselves in their own speech that, you know, aid is like given in hopes of something in return, like advice will be given in hopes of something in return. I don't see why that won't be true under side op. But before 6, I'll take a POI from OO.
All of the incentives of wanting to impose influence happen on both sides. At the very least, what we did was give an equalizer for constructive discourse and a platform to gain more reparations and concessions.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we tell you the nuance of why exactly advice from colonizers are extremely bad. And I don't think an equalizer exists under your side of the house, insofar as as like side government proves to you that there is a large amount of like coercion that exists within the within the strata, right? Like Shireen points out to you 3 potential outcomes and why, even if you listen, even if you don't listen, or even if it is negative or positive advice, it is all still going to boil down to playing into neocolonialism that will still be harmful to these countries at the end of the day. So quickly, before I end the speech, CG takes the debate over OG as well, simply because OG only argues the principle. I don't think OG explains why the principles and the comments are likely to be bad. I think they say that the principle of them commenting is bad in the first place. We explain to you why it is necessarily harmful. We prove to you the practical harms that will likely exist for these countries at a point in time where we are allowing these states to comment on the domestic politics of these colonies. With that, for all the reasons, vote CG.
I thank the speaker for their fine remarks. Would like to call on the op web to conclude the case for side opposition and the debate as a whole. Here.
I'm audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. POIs preferably in the chat. Thank you. Or you can just wave your hand or something. That's also okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in my speech. First, I'm going to explain why our case is better than OO. Second, I'm going to explain and deal with the basic principles coming from the government side. And lastly, I'll deal with the kind of practical arguments coming from the government side, which I believe is mostly derivative, considering the fact that CG only claimed a few impacts that weren't mentioned by OG. So first, let's deal with OO. Why are we better than OO? We are better than OO in 2 ways. First of all, we actually broke the deadlock on self-interest, given that was like a deadlock in the opening bank, right? The idea is that OG argued that because these countries are self-interested, they're not going to make comments in the interest of these countries. And then OO argued that because they have checks and balances and stuff like that, they're going to make comments in the interest of the colonized country. However, I believe this was completely a deadlock. How did we break this deadlock? We broke this deadlock in 2 ways. First of all, we told you that because these countries have the incentive to keep the hegemony of their country within the international community, they have the incentive to comment in good ways. This means that because America is able to take moral high ground over England, this means that they're going to have incentive to comment on these places in a very morally good way. Second, we told you because they want to keep the hegemony of these countries in a way that makes them look bad. For example, whether it be like China's intrusion on human rights violations, because they're able to say that China is bad in this way, this benefits this country in this way. So this means that like even if the idea that these countries are self-interested, these comments doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be bad for the country, but rather can be helpful for the people within the country, specifically for the reason that many times the government may be oppressive, many times the government may be bad to the country of the people, which is something that the colonizer, the superpower, can take into advantage of their own rights, right? This means that like this actually broke the deadlock and explained to you why these comments are going to be helpful, which is something that is crucial to the opposition case, considering the fact that the complete debate was based on the fact of the quality of these kind of comments in the first place. But the second reason why we broke over OOs, the first is because we explained the most important factor in this debate about human rights violations and how this is going to be better on our side of the house. First of all, why is this good? First of all, this is important because this is protecting the most vulnerable actors in the debate who are unable to speak up against their government that is oppressive and stuff like that. But second, just because we proved to you this can only be saved on the input by the superpowers because of the power imbalance here, right? The only argumentation that they gave, that the one and single only rebuttal that CG had against this was that they can just other countries can comment this as well, right? This doesn't really take into the nuance of our argument in which the power imbalance caused by the colonization allows stronger comments to be made. Like this is something that was contention throughout the debate, that because these superpowers have a strong power over these countries, they're able to actually implement change. And I think this was something that was strongly standing in this debate. This was the crucial factor to the opposition case, considering the fact that this is the only rigidly standing argument within this case, considering the fact that things like stability was somehow kind of mitigated by CG. So next I'm going to deal with the kind of principal argument coming from the government side. I think most of it was derivative, mostly CG's case was derivative OG, so I'm just going to like talk about them together. Their basic idea is that because colonization is the basis of the why the country's fucked up today, like these countries should not comment on this. First of all, I would say that like domestic policy, like not I really just don't understand why like the past doing something in the past necessitates you to not do something good today, right? This was never, I gave this POI to like opening government and they never were able to explain this in any way. This means that like if these countries are like better off by these comments, it doesn't really necessitate that like doing something bad in the past necessitates them to not interfere in the country today. So I don't think this was explained. And then OG went on to explain about sovereignty and how sovereignty matters without explaining why sovereignty is like really good. First of all, sovereignty is not an immediate good, considering the fact that sovereignty is good only when it's built on legitimate grounds that allows like governments to function properly without being oppressed, or like it yields the best results for the people. But we don't think this is necessarily the case, right? For example, in oppressive governments that prevent people from actually having a democracy in the first place, or oppressive governments that prevent people from like having freedom of speech, I don't think these governments are built on legitimate grounds to begin with. But many times the governments, like the sovereignty of these governments in this case doesn't really matter. But Cho, take a POI.
Number one, you have yet to still prove how oppressive regimes are suddenly not going to be oppressive just because they get advice. But also number two, if it's true that the influence exists, you have yet to respond to the neo-colonial hierarchy that still exists in safe support.
Yeah, she'll do that later. I'll do that later. And then OG told us that like Western-centric ideas should not be implemented in these countries. This is like ridiculous, right? Like basic human rights exist for all people. Like saying that a country should just not care about the human rights violations of a country, or like saying that democracy is just a Western-centric idea that should not be imposed on other countries. So like completely ridiculous, considering the fact that the people on the ground are already suffering. And I don't think this is an argument that's in the first place. Then let's deal with the argument that the POI and the idea of neo-colonialism mindset. First of all, I think this was a really fluffy argument, considering the fact that they were never explained the impacts of this in any way, right? Why is neocolonialism bad, and why the impacts of this are like going to harm people on the ground in any way? None of this was explained, so I don't understand why this argument should be taken in the first place. First of all, let's notice that like neocolonialism is not necessarily bad, considering the fact that the outcomes that are yielded out of this are better, right? If there are human rights violations within these countries, and like and comparing this to like protecting neocolonialism for whatever reason, I think the former is like comparatively always better. Also, I would say but even if you say that like neocolonialism is bad, I don't understand that how this is going to be better when we don't take the motion. Like I don't think that like white supremacy is going to change just because like white colonialism stops commenting on the domestic policies of these countries. This is dictated by a lot of things like military power, for example, or the land that they have, or the their industry or their like the size of their industry, for example. So I don't think like neocolonialism or the hierarchy between white states and like other developing states is going to change in any way. Therefore, I don't think this argumentation was necessarily important in this debate in any way. And then CZ also ran a case of how there's going to be mismatch at play, and like this is going to like negatively affect these countries. This rights is not going to be really applicable. So first of all, they never explained what this actually looks like. What kind of like mismatch is actually going to happen was something that I simply did not understand. But this is completely avoidable by, for example, actually doing research within these countries, like statistically making searches, or like even if you like fuck up once, it's probably going to be like it's probably going to gain lots of international attention. That's probably going to change the ideas and advice that these countries give the next time. So I don't understand how this is like a really impactful on this debate. So what do we prove to you? We prove to you that one, we believe human rights violations is something that is really important, something that can only be prevented by these superpowers intervening within these countries. But second, we prove to you that the principle doesn't really matter, considering the fact that the people are suffering on the ground today, and we would prioritize this over any past harm that may have been done, which cannot be changed in the status quo. And for all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank everyone for this wonderful round. Now, if everyone could leave the breakout room,